There is something strangely unsettling about a person who remains quiet in a world addicted to noise. Imagine a room full of people talking over each other. Everyone competes subtly for attention, for validation, for relevance. Laughter fills the air, conversations overlap, opinions are thrown around endlessly. And then there is one person saying almost nothing. Not awkward, not insecure, just observing, and somehow everyone notices them. People glance toward them repeatedly without understanding why. Some become nervous around them. Others try desperately to make them speak. A few begin projecting assumptions onto them almost immediately. Arrogant, mysterious, intimidating, judgmental. It is strange how silence makes people reveal them, because silence interrupts something most human beings unconsciously depend on: social predictability. Most people spend their lives performing, adjusting personality for approval, filling empty space so others feel comfortable, constantly signaling emotions, beliefs, humor, insecurity, intelligence, status. Noise comforts people. Silence forces them to confront themselves. A quiet person refuses to participate fully in that performance, and psychologically, that creates tension. Human beings feel safest around individuals they can easily read. Predictable people feel controllable. Transparent people feel manageable. But silence hides intention, and hidden intention unsettles the human mind. You've seen it before. Maybe you've been that person, the one who says less, yet somehow makes others reveal more. Because while everyone else is busy speaking, the quiet person is watching patterns. Tone changes, nervous laughter, contradictions, ego, insecurity, social hierarchy. The person who speaks least often controls the emotional temperature of the room. Not always through dominance, sometimes through absence. That is what makes silence psychologically powerful. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty forces people to project their own fears onto you. Some assume quiet people are weak because they mistake loudness for confidence. Others become intimidated because they cannot predict what the quiet person is thinking. And prediction matters more than most people realize. Society functions through readable behavior. Systems rely on emotional transparency. The easier you are to interpret, the easier you are to influence socially. But quiet individuals disrupt that process. People fear what they cannot easily read. That is why silence can feel threatening, even when no threat exists at all. You are not ignored because you are quiet. Sometimes, and perhaps that is the deeper truth hidden beneath ordinary social interaction, quiet people are feared not because they are weak, but because they interrupt the psychological systems most human beings unconsciously depend on. Human beings were never designed to feel comfortable around silence. For most of history, survival depended on social belonging. Ancient tribes relied on constant communication to detect threats, establish trust, maintain hierarchy, and coordinate survival. People learned to signal emotions, loyalty, intentions, and status continuously through facial expressions, body language, tone, and speech. Communication became psychological reassurance. The more signals people gave, the safer they appeared. And that instinct still exists today. This is why silence unsettles people on a deeply subconscious level. A quiet person gives fewer emotional signals for the brain to interpret, and the human mind hates informational gaps. When information is missing, psychology fills the emptiness automatically. Projection begins. They must be judging me. They think they're superior. In reality, most quiet individuals are not playing psychological games at all. Many are simply observing, processing internally, thinking before reacting. But because they offer little emotional reassurance outwardly, other people begin projecting their own insecurities onto them. Silence becomes a mirror, and most people are uncomfortable with mirrors. This is connected to something psychologists call uncertainty anxiety. Human beings prefer predictable discomfort over unpredictable ambiguity. A loud person may be annoying, arrogant, or emotional, but at least they are readable. The brain knows where they stand. A silent person remains psychologically unresolved, and unresolved things consume attention. Social mirroring also plays a major role. Most conversations operate through emotional reflection. One person laughs, the other laughs back. One person overshares, the other responds emotionally. These exchanges create social comfort because they confirm acceptance and similarity. But quiet individuals often interrupt this rhythm. They do not always react immediately. They do not constantly seek validation. They do not rush to fill space. And in a world addicted to performance, that behavior feels strangely disruptive. Those who do not beg for attention accidentally expose those who desperately need it. Modern society amplifies this even further. Social media has transformed attention into social currency. Everyone is encouraged to constantly display opinions, emotions, achievements, identities, and personal narrative. Visibility becomes proof of existence. People are rewarded for being loud, reactive, and emotionally available at all times. So when someone refuses to participate fully in that system, it creates unconscious tension. Because silence suggests independence from validation. And independence is difficult for socially conditioned minds to understand. This is why silence has historically been associated with discipline and power. Stoic philosophers valued restraint because emotional control created clarity. Monastic traditions practiced silence to escape distraction and observe the mind more deeply. Ancient strategists often used silence deliberately because people reveal themselves more when they are uncomfortable. Even Machiavelli understood the importance of controlled perception. The less people know about your intentions, the harder you become to manipulate. What if people are not uncomfortable with your silence, but with what your silence reflects back to them? That question changes everything. Because eventually, silence stops looking passive. It starts looking powerful, and silence becomes threatening the moment it cannot be controlled. One of the deepest psychological needs human beings have is the need for predictability. People feel safe when they believe they understand someone, when they can predict reactions, emotional patterns, weaknesses, desires, and intentions. Predictable people become easier to trust, easier to categorize, and easier to control socially. That is why unreadable people create tension almost immediately. A quiet person often reveals less emotion, less insecurity, less intention. They react less impulsively. They explain themselves less. And because of that, the people around them lose something psychologically important: certainty. And uncertainty changes power dynamics. Silence is not empty. It is calculation. This is why silence has historically been used by interrogators, negotiators, political leaders, and strategists. In negotiation rooms, the person who speaks first often reveals more pressure. In interrogations, silence creates discomfort strong enough to make people keep talking just to escape the tension. In leadership, controlled restraint can create an image of emotional stability and authority, because the person who reveals less usually gains informational advantage. Most people do not realize how much they expose themselves through constant speech. Fears leak through jokes. Insecurities hide inside exaggeration. Desires reveal themselves through emotional reactions. Motivations become visible through unnecessary explanations. The more people speak, the more patterns they expose. But silence reverses the dynamic. Instead of revealing themselves, quiet people often absorb information while others unknowingly expose who they are. You can see this everywhere once you notice it. In boardrooms, the loudest individuals often fight desperately for dominance, while the quiet observer studies everyone's insecurities. In classrooms, some students speak constantly to prove intelligence, while the silent student watches the social hierarchy unfold. In relationships, One person overshares emotionally, while the other quietly learns exactly what triggers fear, attachment, or validation. The quiet person hears the insecurity hidden beneath confidence. And psychologically, this can feel intimidating because human beings are uncomfortable around people they cannot easily manipulate emotionally. If someone reacts strongly, they become readable. If someone constantly seeks approval, they become predictable. But when a person remains emotionally controlled, calm, and observant, others often project depth onto them automatically. This is where silence begins creating the appearance of, not because silence alone equals intelligence. It does not. A silent fool is still a fool. But controlled silence creates mystery, and human psychology naturally associates mystery with depth. People assume there is something hidden beneath restraint, something strategic, something emotionally disciplined. Ancient thinkers understood this well. Sun Tzu emphasized deception, restraint, and information control in warfare. Machiavelli understood that perception often matters more than transparency in power structures. Stoic philosophers practiced emotional restraint because reacting impulsively gives the external world control over your internal state. Most people speak to control perception. Quiet people observe perception, and that changes everything. Because once you stop needing constant validation through speech, you begin seeing social interaction differently. You notice how often people talk to fill anxiety, how often confidence is simply performance, how often endless noise hides insecurity rather than strength. You were taught that confidence is loud. But history often remembers the people who spoke only when necessary, the leaders who remained calm under pressure, the strategists who listened more than they revealed, the individuals who understood that emotional control creates psychological leverage. And perhaps that is the deeper reason silence unsettles people. Not because quiet individuals are weak, but because controlled silence resists manipulation. A person who constantly reacts emotionally can be guided easily. A person who observes before reacting becomes much harder to control. Modern society rewards visibility. The louder you are, the more the system notices you. Social media rewards constant reaction. Workplaces reward self-promotion disguised as confidence. Group dynamics reward emotional participation. Entertainment culture trains people to constantly perform personality for attention, approval, and relevance. People are expected to react immediately, explain themselves constantly, signal agreement publicly, display emotions openly. And anyone who refuses to participate fully in this performance begins disrupting the social rhythm around them. Quiet individuals violate expectations without even trying, because groups feel safest around emotionally transparent. If someone constantly reveals opinions, insecurities, loyalties, and reactions, the group can categorize them easily. Predictable people fit comfortably into social hierarchies, but quiet people create uncertainty inside the hierarchy. And uncertainty makes groups nervous. This is why silence often attracts strange reactions. Exclusion. Passive suspicion, projection, people begin inventing emotional explanations for behavior they cannot fully understand. They think they're better than everyone. They're hiding something. They're weird. In reality, the quiet person may simply dislike unnecessary performance. But psychologically, non-participation itself can feel threatening in environments built around social signals, because silence weakens many unconscious power games. Think about how much modern interaction depends on emotional reaction. Attention-seeking requires response. Guilt-tripping requires emotional engagement. Social dominance games require visible insecurity. Manipulation often depends on provoking predictable reactions from others. But a person who stays calm and refuses to over-explain disrupts the process, and people often become irritated when their usual methods stop working. Have you noticed how some people become uncomfortable the moment you stop explaining yourself? That reaction reveals more than most conversations ever could. People often attack what they cannot emotionally access. This is one of the hidden truths beneath social conformity. Groups are not always trying to destroy individuality intentionally. Often, they are trying to reduce uncertainty. Social systems depend on shared emotional patterns. When someone resists those patterns, the group unconsciously pressures them back toward predictability. This is how conformity works psychologically. Not always through force, but through subtle emotional punishment. Mockery, exclusion, awkwardness, Over time, many people learn to perform emotional transparency just to avoid tension. They laugh when expected, speak when expected, share opinions when expected, react when expected, and eventually, they lose awareness of how much of their personality became social survival behavior. Quiet individuals unintentionally expose this because when one person stops competing for attention, it reveals how desperately others need it. When one person refuses emotional chaos, it exposes emotional dependency. When one person remains difficult to manipulate, hidden power dynamics become visible. And that visibility makes people uncomfortable, especially in environments obsessed with control, hierarchy, and validation. But there is another side to silence that is rarely discussed. Not all silence comes from confidence. Not all quiet people are powerful observers calmly studying the world. Sometimes silence is protection. Sometimes it is emotional exhaustion. Sometimes it is the result of betrayal, rejection, trauma, or years of learning that speaking honestly creates danger. Sometimes silence is not power. Sometimes it is armor. Not all quiet people were born quiet. Some were created slowly, by betrayal, by humiliation, by being misunderstood too many times. There are people who once spoke openly, trusted easily, explained themselves honestly, until experience taught them that honesty does not always create safety. Sometimes it creates vulnerability. And after enough disappointment, something changes psychologically. The person begins speaking less, not because they have nothing to say, because they learned words are often ignored, twisted, or punished. The most dangerous silence is created when someone learns their honesty has no reward. This is the darker side of quietness people rarely talk about. Society romanticizes extroversion because visibility is easier to understand. Loud personalities feel socially accessible, but internal depth often develops in people who spent years observing instead of being understood. Some people became silent because reality taught them words are rarely enough. Pain can make people withdraw inward. A child constantly dismissed stops expressing emotion freely. Someone repeatedly betrayed becomes cautious with trust. A person mocked for vulnerability eventually learns emotional restraint. Over time, participation turns into observation. And observation changes perception. People who experience emotional unpredictability often become hyper-aware of human behavior. Tone changes, facial expressions, manipulation, hidden tension, mood shifts. Quiet individuals sometimes notice subtle emotional patterns others completely miss because their nervous systems adapted to monitor danger carefully, not out of superiority, out of survival. This is why some quiet people feel strangely perceptive. They learn to read environments before speaking, to analyze reactions before trusting, to detect emotional instability before relaxing completely. Silence became protection. But protection has a cost. Because eventually, emotional withdrawal can become isolating. A person becomes so accustomed to observing others that they stop feeling connected to them. Conversations begin feeling performative. Vulnerability feels risky. Trust feels unnatural. And slowly, silence becomes identity. Not strength, not weakness, just armor worn for too long. That is why silence alone should never be romanticized blindly. Some quiet people are emotional, others are emotionally wounded, and many are both at the same time. The world often mistakes silence for confidence without understanding the pain that sometimes created it. But pain does something strange to perception. It either closes a person completely, or it sharpens awareness. Some people become bitter after suffering. Others become observant. They begin understanding human behavior more deeply because they have experienced its darker side firsthand. Manipulation becomes easier to recognize. Empty validation becomes less impressive. Social performance becomes more obvious. And eventually, a quiet transformation begins. The silence that once came from fear slowly turns into clarity. Silence becomes powerful the moment it is connected to control. Not control over others first. Control over yourself. Most human beings are controlled through emotional reaction. Anger provokes them. Validation seduces them. Fear manipulates them. Attention distracts them. Their emotional state changes constantly depending on the environment around them. And because of that, their behavior becomes predictable. But the person who cannot be easily provoked becomes difficult to manipulate. That changes power dynamics immediately. Emotional control is invisible dominance. This is why calm individuals often appear more powerful than loud ones. In emotionally charged situations, most people react impulsively. They rush to defend themselves, explain themselves, raise their voice, or prove their point emotionally. But the person who remains composed creates psychological imbalance, because calmness disrupts emotional expectations. In negotiation tactics, silence is often used deliberately. A pause after an offer creates tension. The other person begins filling the silence voluntarily, often revealing insecurity or giving away information unnecessarily. In leadership, people who speak slowly and selectively are often perceived as more authoritative because restraint suggests confidence. The person who reacts least often influences most. Ancient Stoic philosophers understood this deeply. They believed emotional discipline created freedom because external chaos could no longer control internal stability. Modern behavioral psychology reaches similar conclusions. Emotional regulation increases clarity, decision-making, and resistance to manipulation. Calmness intimidates those who rely on chaos. Because many social interactions secretly depend on emotional control games. People provoke reactions to feel dominant. They guilt-trip to gain influence. They create emotional tension to force reassurance or attention. But when someone refuses to react predictably, those strategies weaken. Silence creates tension because the human brain searches desperately for certainty. It creates anticipation because people instinctively want emotional feedback. It creates authority because restraint suggests self-control. And ambiguity itself becomes psychologically powerful because people project meaning into what is not fully explained. But there is an important difference between controlled silence and emotional suppression. True silence is not emotional numbness. It is awareness, observation, intention. A person silently holding resentment is not powerful. A person silently avoiding emotion is not emotionally free. Silence only becomes strength when it comes from clarity rather than fear. Because controlled silence means you no longer feel compelled to react to every provocation, defend yourself against every misunderstanding, or seek validation from every person around you. What changes when you stop trying to convince everyone to understand you? That question shifts something internally. You begin conserving energy differently. You observe more. React less. Speak with purpose instead of impulse, and slowly, social dynamics become easier to see. You notice how many conversations are driven by insecurity rather than communication. How much validation people secretly seek. How often emotional chaos is mistaken for confidence. And perhaps that is the deeper reason quiet people unsettle. Not because silence itself is frightening, But because controlled silence exposes something society tries desperately to hide, most human interaction is driven by insecurity, validation, and emotional dependency. Seeing social reality clearly changes the way you experience almost every interaction around you. Once you begin noticing manipulation, performative behavior, emotional games, validation seeking, and invisible power dynamics, it becomes difficult to participate unconsciously the same way again. You start hearing insecurity hidden beneath confidence. You notice how often people speak not to communicate, but to control perception. You begin recognizing how much of modern life revolves around attention, emotional stimulation, and social approval. And slowly, the world becomes louder than it once seemed. Not louder physically. Psychologically, because beneath ordinary conversations, you begin sensing the constant tension driving human behavior. The fear of being ignored, rejected, misunderstood, insignificant, or powerless. Most people spend their entire lives trying to escape those feelings. That is why society rewards endless performance. Constant opinions, constant visibility, constant emotional broad. People are taught to continuously prove they exist through reactions, productivity, popularity, and attention. Silence disrupts that cycle. And perhaps that is why silence can feel isolating once you truly understand it. Because when you stop participating in every emotional game, some relationships begin changing automatically. Certain people become uncomfortable when they can no longer control your reaction. Others lose interest when attention is no longer freely available. Some misunderstand your calmness completely because they are accustomed to chaos being mistaken for personality. But silence is not withdrawal from life. At its highest form, silence becomes conscious presence. It is not superiority. It is not emotional numbness. And it is not fear of it is the ability to exist without constantly performing for approval. That is what many people fail to understand about quiet individuals. Society often assumes silence means emptiness because modern culture equates loudness with confidence and visibility with importance. But not every mind that is quiet is empty. Some people speak less because they finally learned the value of observation changes everything. Because once you stop obsessing over how others perceive you, you begin seeing other people more clearly than ever before. Their insecurities become visible. Their need for validation becomes obvious. Their emotional dependency on attention, approval, and social reassurance becomes impossible to ignore. You notice how some people cannot tolerate silence because silence removes their ability to control the atmosphere emotionally. You notice how quickly others begin projecting assumptions onto quiet individuals, arrogant, cold, judgmental, mysterious, when in reality, the silence is simply forcing people to confront uncertainty. The world fears quiet people because silence interrupts illusion. When someone remains calm and unreadable, others begin revealing themselves automatically. Insecurity surfaces. Emotional dependency becomes visible. Hidden power struggles quietly expose themselves without anyone realizing it. That is why controlled silence feels powerful, not because it dominates aggressively, but because it refuses unconscious participation. You do not need to dominate every room to influence it. Sometimes the person speaking least changes the atmosphere most. Because while everyone else competes for attention, the quiet observer notices the patterns beneath the performance. Who fears rejection? Who seeks validation? Who manipulates emotionally? Who performs confidence while hiding insecurity? Who cannot sit alone with their own thoughts? And once you begin seeing these patterns repeatedly, modern society starts feeling strangely artificial, as though millions of people are trapped inside invisible systems of distraction and emotional conditioning they barely recognize. The loudest systems in society survive by keeping people distracted. Silence breaks that spell. Not through aggression, not through superiority, but through emotional discipline. Through learning that your value does not depend on constant visibility, approval, or noise. And maybe that is the deeper truth hidden beneath all of this. Maybe the reason quiet people are feared is because they hear the truth beneath the noise.